Really pleased to be here today with all of you and welcome you to what has been quite a long time in the making. This is the launch, the kickoff of the KIC, the Collective Impact Coalition for Digital Inclusion, focusing on advancing ethical and responsible AI. I'm so happy to thank our sponsors today, our hosts, which are Canada and the World Benchmarking Alliance. We'll hear more from them, but also we have several speakers and we would really invite audience participation when we have the Q&A session. So let me give an overview of our 1 hour. We will have about 10 minutes of opening remarks from Lourdes Montenegro, who is the lead of the digital sector of transformation, lead of digital sector transformation at the World Benchmarking Alliance. We'll also hear from Tara Denham, who is the Director General for Human Rights, Freedom and Inclusion at Global Affairs Canada. Then we will have 4 speakers from different of our cross-stakeholder members of the Collective Impact Coalition, giving some perspective on why this is an important issue and how we think we can really work together to advance ethical and responsible AI. Then we will have about 15 minutes for Q&A and discussion. Again, we would really appreciate input and feedback from everybody participating. And then we'll do a little wrap up and hopefully keep it tightly within the hour. So if I have to jump in on anybody, I apologize in advance. But again, I would like to welcome you. Thank you so much. I want to acknowledge all the work of the WBA. We have looked at this event for 2 years when I started talking about Fidelity International being involved, and I'm sure the WBA had been working on it even 2 or 3 years before that, gathering the data, publishing the digital inclusion benchmark, really structurally, formally rating companies. The first digital inclusion benchmark came out in December 2020. The next one came out in 2021. We have another one coming out in 2023 in March, and we hope we will by then, through our initiative collectively, been able to improve the statistics and the number of companies that are committing publicly to principles of ethical AI. So to give a little background, let me introduce it to Lourdes. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Your Excellencies, allies, and stakeholders, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your presence in our humble gathering today. As you probably all feel, our world is on fire. As we gather this year at the sidelines of the 77th UN General Assembly, we are faced with tremendous challenges to peace and human development, increasing the obstacles to the achievement of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The UN Secretary General, in his remarks at the opening of the general debate, touched on growing divides exacerbated by new and digital technologies, for which there is no global architecture to deal with global consequences. In our own way, our gathering here today is a glimmer of hope. It is our modest but hopefully meaningful contribution towards the healing of divides through collective action. Today, we publicly launched the Collective Impact Coalition on Digital Inclusion, a collaborative initiative organized by the World Benchmarking Alliance, or WBA, and participated in very actively, by some 40 multi-stakeholder organizations, ranging from civil society organizations to large financial institutions who collectively manage some $6.4 trillion US. From this year to next year, this coalition will be laser focused on increasing corporate accountability on an issue that is of systemic importance towards achieving an inclusive and trustworthy digital transformation, the embrace, adoption of ethical and responsible artificial intelligence. The Digital Inclusion Benchmark, which the WBA has published since 2020, uncovered an alarming lack of public commitment among the world's most influential digital technology companies to follow ethical principles and respect for human rights in the development, procurement, and use of artificial intelligence and its associated technologies. If companies are not held to account, the consequences can be devastating for users and society overall, while companies themselves of course, can also end up facing reputational and revenue losses. For example, without ethical constraints, artificial intelligence will probably exacerbate inequalities, putting vulnerable groups such as women and minorities at risk from further discrimination, or automate away the possibility for developing economies to employ large numbers in industries and alleviate poverty. The World Benchmarking Alliance is a nonprofit founded on the belief in the spirit of SDG 17, Partnership for the Goals. We are pleased to be working closely with our allies, Fidelity International and Boston Common Asset Management, two financial institutions who have stepped up to lead the investor collaborative engagement for the coalition, as well as Women at the Table, who has stepped up to be the leading voice for civil society and non-investor organizations. We are also very proud to be supported by and collaborating with Global Affairs Canada, our co-host for this launch event. Canada has highlighted the need, and wisely so, for a broader concept of digital inclusion to advance the UN Sustainable Development Goals and to ensure that everyone can enjoy the benefits of digital transformation worldwide. Looking forward to everyone's engagement, and again, many thanks for joining us today on the occasion of the public launch of the Collective Impact Coalition on Digital Inclusion. Over to you, Christine.
Thank you so much for that context and overview. I would like to move now to Tara Denham, whom I've introduced already. We are looking forward to her keynote comments on this very important topic.
Thank you, Christine and Lourdes. Very happy to be here today to co-host the event with World Benchmarking Alliance. Obviously, as has been noted, such an important issue and one that Canada has been advocating for a long time. As most of you are aware, Canada has a very advanced and robust AI innovation ecosystem. And we know firsthand that the technology has profound potential to improve the quality of our lives, but also to disrupt the social and economic fabric of our communities, to weaken our democracies, to erode human rights, and to introduce greater insecurity, as Lourdes has noted. And this is why Canada is so firmly committed to the global governance of AI, which is rooted in the respect for human rights. It's also why we've made a broader commitment to build a future where digital technology benefits everyone. A common starting point for this is digital inclusion, which means access, digital literacy, civic participation, and safety online. In terms of what Canada has done globally, we've taken a number of steps towards fulfilling this commitment to digital inclusion. So we're raising awareness around digital inclusion and empowering stakeholders as chair of the Freedom Online Coalition this year. And within the Freedom Online Coalition, we've launched the Task Force on AI and Human Rights to co-develop global norms for AI's responsible use. We're also working with international partners to launch the Global Partnership on AI to harness AI expertise and address critical issues like climate change. And we're also supporting our International Development Research Center in its efforts to launch a global index on responsible AI to help hold states accountable for their human rights obligations and their commitments under UNESCO's recommendation on AI. We feel that by shining a light on the gaps and best practices, our hope is that we can encourage governments and businesses everywhere to live up to their international human rights obligations and responsibilities. Obviously, we are still seeing the negative effects of the lack of a commitment to responsible AI and digital inclusion every day, whether through exclusionary practices, unmitigated bias, or through the deliberate discriminatory use of AI systems. In particular, human rights defenders, women, Indigenous, and LGBTQ2 communities, and traditionally marginalized groups are often unjustly and disproportionately impacted when governments and companies do not respect human rights. So at a time when we see that democracy has been receding globally, authoritarianism is on the rise, and digital technology is becoming ever present ever present in people's lives, it's fundamental that we work together to ensure accountable, inclusive governance of these various technologies for the countries and companies alike. So it's critical that we accelerate private sector engagement in responsible AI. So towards this end, Canada also launched the Responsible Business Conduct Abroad. It's our strategy for the future. We launched it this past April, and this strategy includes preventative measures, legislation in select areas, and access to remedy in the form of non-judicial dispute resolution mechanisms. Recognizing the increasing opportunities and challenges related to responsible technology, this strategy is applicable to all Canadian companies, no matter their size, sector, or scope. So we do firmly believe that open, accessible, and timely information is key to supporting public participation in decision-making and is essential to improving accountability so that policies reflect people's needs on the ground. And so we still have a lot more to do despite our efforts to date. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from the industry experts of the Collective Impact Coalition that are here today and to learn and discuss what it means to adopt responsible business conduct for the digital age. So I'd like to hear more about the challenges and the opportunities that companies face in respecting and promoting human rights and how governments can better support them in their efforts to support digital inclusion. So in this regard, I would like to encourage the World Benchmarking Alliance in the work that you are doing. Your benchmarking exercises have given us excellent data, and I know that your efforts to convene stakeholders will help catalyze these findings into action. And we're happy to see that your 2022 assessment will include even more key performance indicators to refine the standard that citizens can expect for ethical business conduct. And we're really proud to be supporting this project. So let's continue to work to empower citizens, diverse stakeholders in the global north and south to take part in advancing the human rights-based governance of AI systems worldwide. So I look forward to hearing the conversation here today, and I thank you all for your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. That was really helpful to hear a lot of the specific initiatives that the Canadian government is taking. It makes me wonder whether the WBA might rate countries on their efforts in this manner. That might be something to consider. I'd like to move on to one of the industry experts. As you know, the KIC is a collective impact coalition of cross stakeholders. And from the investor perspective, which is one that I share and I'm quite concerned about, we also have with us today Louise Pifot, who is a tech expert, as well as the head of ESG equity integration at Aviva Investors. Thank you for joining us, Louise. Maybe you could give an overview of why ethical and responsible AI is important to investors and what measures can be put into place to regulate, at least from the investor perspective, AI implementation. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I guess if you think about it, artificial intelligence really underpins the tools that are used in everyday life by all citizens, but it also has huge ramifications across sectors that we invest in. And having ethical AI and responsible AI will actually impact society as well as the economy and how we invest. So as investors, when we make investment decisions, we invest with conviction, we invest for the long term, and we need to make sure that management, we have to have the confidence that management is able to identify the different risks and that they manage them. And that also applies to human rights, linking to a few points that were made by other attendees. I think a company that is building AI-based tools will rarely build a tool that is for a negative purpose. They generally are built to actually provide solutions to problems. But the important part is, how is the company really thinking about the different impacts, generally unintended impacts that the tool that they're building could have? And that's the key question that us as investors need to get better ideas of. Because it is an unregulated, largely unregulated industry, companies are able to define themselves what responsible or ethical means. Unfortunately, that's a very subjective challenge. Ethical has a lot of different definitions depending on culture, depending on a lot of different factors. And the way that at the end of the day, a company is able to say, this is what I commit to, which as a WBA, found it's not actually that many companies commit to responsible AI, but even when they do, they generally don't give us that much meat as to how they apply these into their processes. And there's a lot of layers of complexities, to be honest. It's from the design phase to the due diligence, for example, on clients and how clients will use a tool, but also probably misuse a tool. So there's a lot of layers of complexities that actually companies need to think through. And we as investors lack the amount of information that we would like with any other risks generally. We need, as I said before, we need to understand how management understand and identify, understand, manage, and mitigate the different risks that they have. And so that's the same for artificial intelligence. I think respecting human rights is the main point that we want to be able to hold companies accountable to, because that's what's important in terms of the broader investor context. I think I tried to answer your questions through quite a few things, but it is not enough to ask companies to disclose and to say to users, this is potentially having a negative impact. You need to have reassurance that they're managing that negative impact. And it's not a matter of net impact. It's not a matter of having the positive impacts outweighing the negative ones. It's a matter of really making sure the negative ones don't appear, because otherwise you get to the stage where technology companies have a huge impact on society, generally speaking. As Sarah was mentioning earlier, democracy, etc. These are non-measurable aspects that we can't ask companies to really clearly measure, because that's not measurable. So it's a matter of really having the robust management systems.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to the topic or discuss more how we can collectively work together. So we've heard some of the government perspective from Canada, some of the investor perspective. Caitlin, if I could move to you, please. And you could speak a little bit with us about what role civil society can play in ensuring ethical and responsible AI, and how multi-stakeholders can work together to get companies to put in place these frameworks that, as a starting point, we think would be helpful to see.
Well, I thank you very much for the question. I mean, I think at the very bottom line, it's the fact that we're all citizens and we all have actually a stake in what's happening with these emerging technologies. And we are citizens who are also technologists and data scientists, as well as activists, as well as academics, as well as governments. So we all have a part to play in this, and we all have a right to play in this. I'm a very big proponent of a human rights-based approach from which we can then sort of add to whatever holes we may find in the treaties and conventions that we've all agreed to worldwide. We can add other ethical dimensions, but I would love to see something where we all agree. It's not really a la carte ethics. It's not really a la carte responsible AI or emerging tech, but it really is based on these very fundamental principles that everybody agreed to in 1948, and we're still aspiring to fulfill. So given that we're all citizens, and I've just sort of opened this up to the whole world and the way that the whole world can work together, I would like to say, I think one of the most profound changes that we could make in this construction of AI is to make sure that there are multidisciplinary groups around the table creating the technology. That goes from social scientists, anthropologists, social workers, psychologists, behavioral economics, whoever, in indigenous activists, people who are experts in their own lived experience. I think too often we have now given over this role of technologists, made technologists kind of gods, and I don't think that they've necessarily asked for that particular role to be techno-solutionists. They have hammers, they just know how to hammer nails. They want to sort of meet other people. They want to have understand other ways of creating their tech. And we need to have the people who are most affected by the technology sitting at the very moment of creation of the technology with the technologists and the social scientists. So that means it also should be really community-based. I think that's one of the most powerful things that we could do to sort of change the equation. And I would also add on the other end that we take a life cycle approach. So it's not only looking at the data that we know has a tremendous amount of holes, it being historical data with many gaps of invisibility, many people not being counted in the data, but also looking at the models where there are a lot of old-fashioned assumptions that are being brought along with the old-fashioned data into this new technology, but that we don't stop at the point of making a product and deploying it, but we understand that the way that this technology works is it has a life cycle. It grows. They're like seeds or like children. Each of them change. Each model is different, and that we need to take a life cycle approach and tend to each of these emerging technologies, bits and pieces of it, as it goes out into the wild and into our society, and see how it interacts and course correct as needed.
That's a nice metaphor. I do think we're relatively early in the life cycle of AI, but one of the biggest risks, as I think we're all aware, is how quickly it's advancing, and it grows so much faster than regulations and investors, and some of us can really keep up with it. So I also wanted to take a step back, and I'm so sorry I forgot really properly to introduce Caitlin Kraft Buckman. I think every participant got the program with the bios, but in case you didn't, Caitlin is the founder and entrepreneur of several civil society organizations that have focused on inclusion, particularly with respect to gender and technology. So thank you for your participation and input with your great perspective. Next, I would like to turn to Benga Saison, who is the Executive Director of Paradigm Initiative, which is a Pan-African social enterprise working on digital inclusion and digital rights. So also quite an expert in this specific area from his perspective. And Benga, thank you for joining us. I'd like to ask your overall thoughts of this collective impact coalition that we are launching today, and specifically what you think we can do to drive corporate responsibility on ethics and responsible AI.
Thanks, Christine, and hello, everyone. It's great to discuss coalition. And I say that because where we are right now in the world is quite an interesting place. People are having conversations about different internets, splitting the internet. People are talking about countries moving to the extreme of nationalism, and of course you can see that in the elections across various countries and in the politics of it. But as we discuss the collective impact coalition on digital inclusion today, it's particularly exciting for me, not just because we're launching another coalition. I mean, it feels great to launch coalitions, but because at this particular time, the impact of this coalition is much needed. Coalitions come with their wins, and of course with some work that needs to be done. I say to people that when you look at the simple laws of mathematics, 1 + 1 is 1, 1 + 1 is 2, 1 × 1 is 1. So it looks like addition is much better. If you do your thing and I do my thing, maybe it's better. When you look at 2 + 2 is 4, 2 × 2 is 4, you're like, it doesn't make any difference. You do your thing, I do my thing. But as you progress and you continue to stick with working together, 3 + 3, when you do your different things, is 6, or 3 × 3 is 9. So it becomes much obvious that the impact of coalitions are bigger. And if you go to 4, 4 + 4 is 8, 4 × 4 is 16. And if my math is right, 5 + 5 is 10, 5 × 5, you can go to 25 + 25. Let me test myself a bit. And 25 × 25 goes all the way, higher and higher. And as you go, you realize that working in silos and bringing them together can never be as powerful as working together and multiplying our efforts. So this is the reason why I think that what we're doing today, which is something we are very excited to do a Paradigm Initiative, work with others and build coalitions. I think it's an important step that we're taking, and particularly in the area that we're focusing on, ethics and responsible use of AI. We've had a lot of inequality, we've had a lot of tokenism, we've had a lot of bias built into technology systems, over the last few decades. But here we are, we have an opportunity to build more, just, more equitable, and even better systems. And I think this is where, civil society organizations have been playing a leading role. And of course, in working together, like I said earlier, in coalitions with businesses and governments and with others. One of the challenges that we found, Paradigm Initiative, in our work in research and advocacy, is that when we look, for example, at COVID-19, we look at the period of lockdowns and what governments were doing, and we realized that many governments were actually taking advantage of the COVID lockdowns to promote policies that do not really help with digital rights in terms of data protection. It became an excuse to extend, for some also, the opportunity to close civic spaces. So one of the beautiful things that we're doing today is that we're able to have honest conversations between governments, between the private sector, between civil society, between the academia and researchers and others, to be able to make sure that everything we do is built on two things. Number one, built on trust, and number two, built on rights, which is the respect, dignity, and all of that. Because if we're doing all of the work we're doing, it's supposed to be about the people that we're working for. So trust, ethics, and rights. And of course, I'm sure that what we're coming together to do today is not just another coalition we're forming. It's an opportunity to multiply our efforts instead of working alone and adding them together, because coalitions apparently have bigger impacts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate those were well said comments. We're also pleased to welcome today Wayne Holmes, who is an AI research consultant with UNESCO. And Wayne brings valuable academic perspective as well as policymaking perspective. And I think it'd be really helpful to hear from you, Wayne, on how you think policymakers, in light of what we've been talking about, what can they do to best ensure the implementation of ethics in AI?
Thank you, Christine. It's good to be here and to be speaking. I think the problem is that the world of AI, as has been mentioned, is fast changing, but it's also complicated, and it raises many different issues that often get missed. So, for example, the rule of unintended consequences. Most people, all the people I know who are involved in developing AI technologies, they're motivated by ethical concerns. They want to improve the world. But as we've seen in many instances, ethical intentions are not by themselves sufficient. And good intentions don't always result in ethical designs or ethical deployments. And so we have to be ready for these unintended consequences. One example is the use of facial recognition, which in some contexts has led to discriminatory policing. Another example is the use of AI-assisted teacher evaluations that have led to teachers being sacked from their jobs, despite their records of providing high-quality teaching over many years. So the reality is, even if we get the right regulations in place, how does that move forward to address unintended consequences? How do we identify and mitigate such consequences before they become a problem? Or in other words, how do we ensure that AI is ethical by design, not afterwards? I think the other problem that regulators have, and this has come up with the work that the EU is currently doing, is that there is the assumption that ethics is all about preventing. It's all about preventing bad things happening. Whereas actually, we probably need to turn that around so that ethics is about facilitating innovation. Now, with that in mind, the reality is that lots of international corporations have established their own in-house ethics committees. But the problem there is that all too often it can lead to ethics washing. You know, the corporations, they feel they ticked the ethics box, but then they just carry on as they've been doing anyway. And with those examples, when we get corporate ethics committees where the members do actually criticize publicly what the corporation is doing, the solution that tends to be used is, rather than amending what they're doing, they just simply fire the people who've made the comments. So not only do we need to think about what the regulations might be, but we also need to consider how they can be implemented throughout society, particularly in the corporate domains. So from my perspective, although researchers and developers in general are definitely taking a serious look at the ethics of AI technologies, we have to ask ourselves, is that sufficient? Is it sufficient to depend on those corporations to do the work and ethics that we know is needed? So instead, do we need regulations at national level or even global level to ensure that AI is genuinely designed, developed, deployed, you know, for the common good? And if we do need those regulations, and a lot of us think we do, we also need to ensure that these are not imposed. So it shouldn't be, you know, typically the global north getting together, deciding what these regulations should be and insisting that the world applies these. And instead, it's about ensuring that there is cooperation, partnership, discussion that's genuine, that's real, to ensure that we really do take into account local context, local cultures, local needs, as well as the more general approaches to AI ethics. So, you know, regulations are important, and they stem from those kinds of conversations that we need to have, that this coalition is all about setting up, and we need more of this. And we, you know, in a phrase, we need to ensure that the regulations that do get put into place do not get involved in what's being termed AI colonialism. We need to ensure that it's done in partnership.
Excellent, excellent points. Definitely rounding out the perspective there. Thank you, Wayne. We are mostly right on time to open it up to the audience for questions. I unfortunately don't have access to the chat, so I might ask either Nicholas or Lourdes to share the questions, or you can send them to me and I'll read them out, or we can also do the reactions by raising hands on the screen and seeing if we have hands up. We could call on people to provide some input, ask some questions of our speakers. We would really like to get a conversation going. And some of you I know, so I might cold call you. I don't want to cold call someone who's just kind of listening in the background. That would be rather embarrassing. But please do. We've got some great experts here that we could learn from specifically if you'd like to hear more. I guess in the absence of any coming yet, and I'm trying to scroll across, I guess the area that I know less about, focusing as an investor on companies and what we're launching as we engage with companies on this initiative, I just don't know as much about the regulatory approaches and what governments are doing. And I was sort of intrigued by what I think is quite an ambitious call, and you've phrased it, Wayne, in terms of not having AI colonialism. What are the actual like mechanisms by which we could achieve that? I mean, it seems like a very aspirational long-term goal that, you know, everyone around the world will work together, can get local, we can get national to have a global resolution. But for those of you with more expertise in that area, how can we think about that? And that might be a question for Lourdes, it might be a question for Wayne. And Caitlin, it looks like you're holding your hand up, but maybe you're not.
Yeah, I'll start it off and let them then take it over. I mean, we are talking a lot now, happily, about digital colonialism, which really is about talking about using the data that comes from the North and applying it without context, without purpose, to the South. I'm absolutely excited and exhilarated about going into that exploration. However, I do think that there is a way, I think that we probably have tremendous commonalities, not in the data, but in terms of what we want the emerging technology, which here we're calling AI, but I think it really should be about all emerging technologies to do, which is really to support our economic and social rights, our right to water, our right to land, all the things that are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I don't think it's going to be very hard, therefore, for us to agree on what we want the outcomes to be. I'm a personal believer that if we get too prescriptive on the technology is going to move well. Technology is moving very, very quickly. And that there's no way to we can't deal with it like it's a legal framework, as you know, laws about redress and about remedy. And I think that we have to, whatever kinds of regulations we come up with, it has to be somewhat aspirational, and things are just going to have to kind of meet that standard. That's my opinion. But I don't think that there's going to be, I'd like to hear what Benga thinks about this, that there's going to be so much difference between what the North, the South think. It might be an East-West divide, but what the North-South think about what a responsible AI framework might be.
Well, can I come in and give an example? My area of interest is AI and education, both the application of AI in education and the teaching of AI. And there's a lot of talk. There was a very large funded prize some years ago about developing an AI teacher. And the idea was in the global South or developing countries in general, particularly in rural areas, the reality is we do not have sufficient qualified, experienced teachers to give the children of that area the education to which they have a human right. So the argument was very much, well, look, we can develop these AI tools and put them into that context. We haven't got human teachers, so let's put the AI in and do that. Well, apart from the fact that I am unaware of any AI tool that can be anywhere near as effective as a human teacher, all that really does is kick the problem down the road. It addresses what appears to be a problem to outside eyes. These children are not getting the education they deserve, but actually doesn't address the real problem. The real problem is that those particular contexts don't have sufficient qualified teachers. So instead of using the AI expertise to replace teachers, why don't we use those AI techniques to support human teachers to become better teachers, to become trained as teachers? So that's an example of where a decision from outside the local context has looked at the local context. Well, we can see the problem and we will bring in a solution from outside that deals with it, rather than ensuring that those in the local context have the opportunity to discuss and explore and explain what the real problem is for them, so that then we can work together in partnership. And Benga's notion of the multiplication effect of partnerships, I completely agree with. And that's what we need, is not just solutions developed in the West or in the North that are then applied, but actually working together, bringing expertise, but different types of expertise together in partnership.
Yeah, I think that's super important to keep in mind going forward. We've had another question from Julia at Saracen. I wonder, Julia, if you could speak your question to the group. I've seen it coming through on my chat, but others might have prospective answer as well, if you wanted to chime in.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? So my question is, as our first round of engagements with companies that do not have published policies on ethical AI will be to encourage them to develop these policies and disclose them on their website. Do you think that we could take a step further to kind of develop joint standards for those policies? Or maybe they should not be kind of unified across all the geographies or all the sectors that we're trying to cover, but with somewhat specifics for each geography and sectors we just discussed, but still kind of a standardized framework, because otherwise you won't be able to avoid a situation when a company develops, some kind of set of general principles and a lot of wording around it, puts it on their website and claims that this is a legitimate policy. So what level of detail, what exactly the questions are that we want them to cover in their policies? What exactly the risks that we want them to control and avoid by doing this? I know there is no kind of answer at this stage, but my question is whether we can aim to develop something to work on something like this and standardize it. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just make a comment, and then I'd love to see if I know it's kind of a big group to be calling on people, but if anyone has a really strong feeling about the specifics of the framework, I did want to make sure when we talk about the KIC and the investor work stream, we have now 30 investors that represent nearly $7 trillion that are part of this KIC. And we have committed to engaging collectively with 40 of the 130 companies that were found by the Digital Inclusion Benchmark not to have published commitments. And our purposes are to raise awareness of the issue, to share practices, and quantitatively to improve the number of companies. So it's kind of low-hanging fruit, we think, to ask companies to have a policy. But we do see that just to have a policy for the sake of putting some words up on your website is really a small first step, and we're hoping and trusting companies to be more ethical than that, and I think most of them are and want to do the right thing, and they want to do it right. So I keep feeling like this is 10 or 20 years ago, like climate, people knew you needed to have a climate policy, but not what a good one looked like. So how and when can we get to a policy that, or a set of frameworks or principles that are robust, but as Caitlin was saying, maybe not too prescriptive? If anyone has perspectives on that, throw your hand up, and otherwise we'll put that as a kind of rhetorical thing for all of us to think about, and then we'll go to the next question, which will be coming from Jordan. I don't see a hand to answer this question. Yeah, go ahead,
I have a hand. I just want to say, at the risk of, this will be my last intervention, but we, for the British government, we just were the technical authors for a standard that's a fast track standard called digital inclusion. And we took the point of view with a very extensive and really amazing advisory group that we wouldn't be too prescriptive, but we would lead, even though these are standards makers, so they're really very in the weeds, a list of like critical analysis that people needed to do in order to make the decisions that were appropriate for that particular process in that particular sector in that particular product that they were making, because there's never going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. However, if we can help people be comfortable with asking a series of really critical, simple questions, just really, where's the data from? Who's it for? Who does it serve? Was there consent? There's a list to begin, and other questions. I think that we would be on the right track. And I do think the standards makers of the world are stepping in, and there will be standards relatively shortly. Thanks.
I was just going to add one quick thing. And we have lots of AI standards, lots of AI frameworks, sets of AI principles, ethical principles. The question really centers on how do we translate those principles, those frameworks into practice? And I agree completely with Caitlin, we can't be prescriptive about that, but we still have to think about this. What does this mean in practice?
And Caitlin, your hand is up. I'm going to assume you want to lower it from on your reaction screen. And Benjamin's hand is up. Is that to make a comment, or if it's to ask a fresh question, we have a queue? But go ahead. Let's keep this conversation going. And then if Rufai has a question or comment on this topic as well. Great. Thanks.
Hi, Christine. Thank you very much. So yeah, I've got a comment on this, which kind of answers the question of what does a policy framework look like, or what should we be aiming for? I've been working with a bunch of investors, quite a lot on this call today, and part of the coalition. We've been working on facial recognition and trying to engage companies and trying to find out what best practices are in that particular field. And obviously, we've been speaking about ethical AI. And when it comes to some of the best practice we've observed, we found that it's not about having a policy, which is just at the end of the day just a piece of paper or just a bit of writing on a website, but it's really about companies asking the right questions internally and having the right framework and governance internally, and going outside of the company to find expertise. And we found that the companies that were most vocal about their questioning of what is ethical AI were the ones that had the best practices in place. So everything kind of followed throughout their operations. Some companies have published on this, and we'll actually have something to share with you in the next couple of days. We're going to publish a paper on what we've found out. But yeah, so just as I say, so we found that some companies were, putting out papers about what they felt was ethical AI or ethical use of facial recognition, and there were some really interesting performance, that followed through. So that's my comments on what we should be aiming for, is to see companies think about it, because it's not ethical AI is not a science. It's a questioning, and by the minute you start writing a code, you introduce bias, but you need to show that you have thought about it. That's my my 10 cents on it.
No, thank you. That's really helpful. And I don't know if others are aware that Benjamin's with Candrium, which has been leading a collective or a collaborative engagement, specifically looking at facial recognition and engaging with companies on that topic, which is obviously of great concern for many reasons. We're running out of time for questions. I did want to let Dee Rafai make a quick comment or question, if she will. And then Michael Minga had a comment, and he was one of the data researchers and people that has worked very closely on the digital inclusion benchmark with WBA. So I'd love for him to be able to say a word, and then we'll come back to our speakers for a minute or two of brief comments, having followed this discussion before we close it up. So yeah, Dee, if you'd like to go ahead.
Hey, Christine, great to see you. So I guess my question, and I'm the newbie here, so admittedly I'll put my hand up, but I wanted to understand what's our purpose as a group here? Because reading kind of the intro to this meeting, it was like we were focusing on these 130 companies and we were looking to see how we can improve that. But from hearing the conversation here, it seems to be a much broader aspiration to go across all companies, across all technologies, across all geographies. And I'm just wondering, are we gonna bite little bits off first and then on a pathway to something, or is there kind of a collective view as to what we want to accomplish out of the group?
Right, so I'll answer that, and if Lourdes wants to fill in. I think that for the investor group, and I think this holds true for the broader KIC, our purposes, as I mentioned, are we want to raise awareness. So I think we're certainly doing that through even events like this. We want to improve understanding of best practices and spread that knowledge, which an earlier event in September, this event, and our ongoing dialogue across investors and across the cross-stakeholder group will provide. Those are all sort of soft goals. The hard goal, as I mentioned, is to increase the number of companies on the digital inclusion benchmark that have made public commitments to responsible development and deployment of artificial intelligence. So it's, again, in a way, a low-hanging fruit. Obviously, it opens quite a Pandora's box, but the Pandora's box is open. Now we're trying to get our hands around, where those little things coming out of the box are flying and how we can, try to maintain them in a way that respects human rights, and ethics across the board, which is obviously extremely complex and multi-layered, as some of our speakers have said. Michael Minga, let me call on you to make your comments, or maybe it was a question, I'm not quite sure because I couldn't see the detail, but I did want to acknowledge all of your contributions, which have been incredible, and see what you would like to provide today.
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, it was in response to, I think Wayne said that ethics committees were important, you know, to have a diverse range of views on ethical AI. And we thought so too when we were designing the benchmark. So we said, does the company have an ethics committee, and does it look into, you know, ethical areas beyond the sort of traditional ones? So not only ethical AI, but even, you know, are you debating whether your product might lead to unemployment and things like that? And what we found was that every single company with an ethics committee, they don't look at AI, they're just looking at these old ethics considerations like harassment or corruption. But we did discover that some companies have set up specific ethical AI committees that are usually then interdisciplinary. So one of the questions we have is whether we should still be looking at whether a company has an ethics committee in general, or whether it's better for them to set up a dedicated ethical AI committee. And a couple of other things based on the discussion. So in terms of what these principles seem to have in common, it was always paying lip service to the so-called FAT principles: fairness, accountability, and transparency. But again, generally not without a lot of detail. And one way maybe of looking at their ethical AI principles is what they want to allow AI to be used for. And in that case, Alphabet's a really good example, because they say we won't, you know, allow our AI to be used for anything that will violate human rights, or we won't allow it to be used for mass surveillance. We won't allow it to be used for weapons. So I think that then makes it, you know, also really clear that, you know, you're not going to allow these uses of your AI products.
Yeah, that's really helpful. It's nice to have your very specific expertise and your insight on that. We only have 7 minutes. We have 5 speakers. So if I could ask each of you maybe to give 1 minute of commentary. It could be an open-ended question for the group to think about, and think about how we can work collectively together to find answers. But why don't we go ahead and then we'll end with Lourdes wrapping it up. So Tara, if you have a brief comment or question you'd like to leave the group with, please.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the conversation. Listen, a few things stuck out for me. Again, that idea of that diversity of voices, but meaning in a meaningful way, right? So it's not just to continue to bring those voices to the table, but what are you asking them? And I like that last question. Is it about ethics committees within companies, but ethics in which way, right? So we have to push beyond and look at the broader sense. And of course, as I've said at the start, we are always been advocating for the human rights-based approach. There's a lot of conversations about ethics and how it can be interpreted. But I like the comment about framing it around how to use these lenses to maximize the positive impacts for companies, right? So yes, we can say it won't be used for this, but how can we also have companies, and I'd be interested to understand, how can we have companies understand that by taking this approach, you can actually maximize the positive impacts of the technology you're rolling out, which could also, you know, have that positive relay to the company itself. So just some different framings that I'm intrigued by, but thank you again for.
Thank you. And Louise, if you would like to speak for a moment, please.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think, you know, Viva Investors is really exciting of being part of this collaborative initiative in terms of getting the collaboration going. This was a great first launch. I think one of the things I would like to close with is kind of a response to several questions that were in the chat with regards to what can investors look for. And my connection is unstable, so I'm hoping you can still hear me, but it's popping up with the message. I would like to second some of Benjamin's point in terms of the facial recognition initiative, which really was looking at several key points of disclosure and of how companies think about this. And it is beyond how you think about your principles and how you commit to following your principles, but also how do you implement them throughout your design to client use. I think one of the key things that investors should be looking for is about impact assessments and how the companies use that impact assessment through decision making. I think that's my one key takeaway that I think every investor on the call should kind of take away with. Thanks.
Thank you. I pride myself on timekeeping. I know everyone's extremely busy, and I have someone knocking on my conference room door. So, Caitlin, if you have a brief, less than 1 minute takeaway, that would be fantastic. Or then we'll pass
I
it
think
to
it's
Benga.
if we're looking, investors are looking for answers, but I think also investors need to ask questions. And I think if we could all commit ourselves to this critical analysis, both the technologists, the multidisciplinary stakeholders that are sitting around the table with the technologists, that are the communities with the lived experience, plus the social scientists and the other technologists and the investors, then we're going to sort of get somewhere. But I think it's about asking questions at this point.
Yeah, I would very much second that thought. Benga, if you have a brief comment, we'd appreciate that.
Benga lost his connection, Christine.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Let's move to Wayne, and then we'll have Lourdes. You can go straight on in after Wayne and wrap it up.
Thanks, Christine. We've all acknowledged that AI is pretty complicated, but what we've not really acknowledged is that ethics is also pretty complicated. You know, people have been discussing ethics for 2,000 years. And so when people engage in ethics, we can't expect really simple solutions to pop out the other end. It's not just about the obvious. It's not just about the transparency, explicability, etc. It's about far more complex issues. And in particular, the ethics of AI changes according to the domain in which the AI is being applied. So the ethics of AI in medicine has a lot in common with, but a lot of different stuff to ethics of AI in transportation, or the ethics of AI in education. So I think that would be my parting shot. Ethics is complicated, and we can't expect simple solutions.
Thank you so much. Lourdes, would you like to close it? And if I get thrown off here, I apologize in advance, and thank everybody for joining.
Thanks, Christine. Definitely, I just like to amplify what Benga has said, you know, about the multiplication of our efforts. We see a lot of great collaboration among investors, and therefore the next step and the next challenge is the multi-stakeholder collaboration, the collaboration between the investor community as well as the civil society and non-investor community in the coalition. So let's put our heads together, and some of the questions that were stated here is definitely can be answered by saying, yes, we can. They can be collaborative actions. So if you ask, can we come with some kind of framework, clarity, and best practices? Why not? We can work together on that. That's what collective action is all about. And this is only the beginning. We're just starting. We have said that this is just a first step. It doesn't have to end in 2023. We're just trying to make sure that there's industry-wide awareness and adoption of responsible and ethical artificial intelligence. And definitely let's ramp it up and deepen the conversation and look at what needs to be done following that. So it's not the end, we're just beginning. And it's all very exciting.
This is and was the kickoff of our kick. We would like to thank you all so much for joining. I think you have all of our contact details. If you have follow-up thoughts, if you'd like to get more involved, please do reach out to us, and particularly the WBA. Thank you so much for all of your work on these very important topics. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.